Hello and welcome everybody. Good morning to the East Coast of the United States. Good evening to Asia. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Matt Rojansky. I'm director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. This is our 8th installment of the Global Perspectives series, where we look at countries around the world and their relations with Russia and Russia's relations with them. Today, we're very pleased to be working together with the Asia program here at the Wilson Center and my wonderful colleague, Jean Lee, who will speak to us in moment. She directs the Wilson Center's Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. And of course, our special guest today is Andrei Lankov, whom Jean will introduce in greater detail and who will talk to us about Russia's relationship with North Korea. Before we get started, I want to remind you that to keep track of all of our work on Russia, Eurasia, the region, you can follow our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File, as well as our blogs, also the Russia File and Focus Ukraine, and you can find those all through the Kennan Institute's website. Speaking of the website, you can find our email there, which you can email right now, starting this minute and anytime throughout the hour to submit questions to us. That's Kennan, Kennan, at wilsoncenter.org. You can also tweet us your questions at Kennan Institute or post them on the Kennan Institute Facebook page. Please, when you do that, make sure to include your name and affiliation so I know who's asking the question. So now I want to introduce Jean Lee, who in turn will introduce Andrei and begin our conversation. Jean, as I said, directs the Wilson Center's Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy. She is a Pulitzer-nominated veteran foreign correspondent and herself an expert on North Korea. She led the AP's new coverage of the Korean Peninsula as bureau chief from 2008 to 2013. And in 2011 was the first American reporter granted extensive access on the ground in North Korea. And in January 2012, opened up AP's Pyongyang Bureau, the only Western text photo news bureau based in the North Korean capital. She's made dozens of extended reporting trips to North Korea, visiting farms, factories, schools, military academies, and homes in the course of her exclusive reporting across the country. During her tenure, AP's coverage of Kim Jong-il's 2011 death earned an honorable mention in the deadline reporting category of the 2012 AP Media Editors Awards for Journalism in the United States and Canada. She also won an online journalism award in 2013 for her role using photography, video, and social media in North Korea, and was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in feature reporting in 2013. She's a native of Minneapolis and has a bachelor's degree in East Asian Studies and English from Columbia and a master's degree from the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. She worked as a reporter for the Korea Herald, Seoul, before being posted with AP to the news agency's bureaus in Baltimore, Fresno, California, San Francisco, New York, London, Seoul, and Pyongyang. Jean previously served as a Wilson Center Public Policy Scholar and a Global Fellow before joining the Asia program as the Korea Center Program Director. She's a contributor to the New York Times Sunday Review, Esquire magazine, and other publications, and appears as an analyst for CNN, BBC, NPR, PRI, and other media, serving frequently as a guest speaker on Korea-related topics. She is a member of the National Committee on North Korea and Council of Korean Americans, and is, I would add, a wonderful colleague here at the Wilson Center, a true expert in the best sense of that word, and I'm very happy to hand you the floor, Jean, please.
Thank you, Matt, for that uber detailed introduction. It is just such a delight to be able to have this conversation with you, and absolutely my pleasure to see Professor Andrei Lankov back at the Wilson Center, albeit virtually, for today's discussion about Russia and North Korea. So just a little bit about him. Dr. Lankov is a professor of history at Kookmin University in Seoul, South Korea, where he's taught since 2004. So thank you, Andrei, for staying up late to join us today. He completed his undergraduate degree and his PhD at Leningrad State University. And I believe he spent some of that time studying in Pyongyang at Kim Il-sung University. So certainly not an opportunity many of us have. And I think that certainly informed so much of his analysis on North Korea. He's written a number of books on North Korea over the years. And I have to tell you that some of them were among the first books I bought when I was posted to Seoul as AP Bureau Chief. And I'm just going to mention a few of the titles: From Stalin to Kim Il-sung, The Formation of North Korea, 1945 to 1960, Crisis in North Korea, The Failure of De-Stalinization, and North of the DMZ, Essays on Daily Life in North Korea, and The Real North Korea. Those are among the books that he's written, incredibly prolific. He's also a former Wilson Center Fellow. He did do a stint with the Kennan Institute. So we're happy to have him in our alumni network, and definitely seen him lurking around our history and public policy program doing archival research as well. So I just want to say that I think this discussion we're having today is very timely. We did not know when we scheduled this how timely it would be, but the South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, is literally on his way to Washington, D.C., will be arriving later today for a summit with President Biden. And North Korea is sure to be on that agenda. We also have Secretary Blinken meeting with Sergei Lavrov in Iceland today. And meanwhile, the North Koreans have been extremely quiet, very quiet on the diplomatic front. They've cloistered themselves in a kind of self-imposed isolation since January 2020. And that has raised a lot of concerns about the state of North Korea's economy, and I would say questions about how they're getting the money to stay afloat and to continue to build their weapons arsenal. So given the possibility that we'll start to see more multilateral diplomacy on North Korea with the Biden administration, I think it's a good time to look closely at all the relationships so that we can better understand both the historical and the current dynamics that are at play. And so I am really looking forward to hearing Dr. Lankov share his insights on how he sees Russia and North Korea positioning themselves at this critical juncture. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Lankov, and I'm going to turn the Zoom podium over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I have been basically at the center, at the institute many times. I don't know even how many, quite a lot. But well, due to the current situation, it's impossible. Anyway, thank you for inviting me so I can at least participate in our kind of virtual event. Well, and now go straight to the business. Is Russia important to North Korea? Is North Korea important to Russia? I would say to an extent, in some degree, maybe less than most people are inclined to believe, but still important. What are the major goals and concerns of Russia, some of which reflect the current domestic political situation and authoritarian trends of the current Russian government? And some are pretty universal. So if one day within our lifetime, Russia becomes a full democracy, which is a big if, I don't think that many of these trends are going to be seriously different. So what are the major goals of Russia? Probably I will start from kind of defining three major goals Russia has in dealing with North Korea. First of all, Russia is interested in status quo, or we actually should divide it into two parts. First of all, Russia wants stable Northeast Asia. Why? Not because Russia is such a peace and stability-loving country, but any conceivable trouble near very vulnerable, sparsely populated, and frankly sort of underdeveloped Russian Far East is not going to be a good news. Also, countries which are likely to take advantage of such a trouble are largely countries whose relations with Russia are relatively, well, not perfect, let's say. I wouldn't say bad, sometimes bad. So Russia wants stability because it has little to gain from, yes, of course, every crisis means opportunities. You can be dynamic, decisive, ruthless, brutal, determined, and you can get a lot from a crisis. Problem is resources. Russia doesn't have resources and doesn't have much interest in dealing with a possible crisis in this part of the world. So stability comes first. Second, Russia would like to see status quo, which means division. Of course, official line of the Russian government, American government, any government is that we all dream about unified Korea. I strongly suspect that any government, with the possible exception of the United States, and not because of the United States are remarkably selfless, but because of completely different reasons, I don't think that any government really would like to see a unified Korea right now. And Russia is no exception, because unified Korea is likely to be dominated by the South. Probably it will remain a close ally of the United States, and it's definitely a bad news for the Russian government. Or alternatively, a crisis in North Korea might trigger Chinese intervention and emergence of a Chinese-controlled regime in what is now North Korea. Well, probably it will still have the same name. Neither scenario is good. So Russia would like North Korea to be stable and Korean Peninsula divided, stably divided. No war, no revolution, no unification, no famine, nothing dramatic is the basic line. And what about denuclearization? It's clearly a part of agenda, but it's a very distant third. Stability comes first. By the way, Russia will grudgingly accept unification as long as it goes smoothly. Division maintenance comes second, and denuclearization comes third. But there is one problem. In recent years, few, if any, Russian analysts, both inside and outside the government, seriously believes that there are any real chances that North Korea would surrender its nuclear weapons. Some people here probably remember that I spent last 15 years at least basically yelling at every corner that denuclearization is not going to happen. It's getting a sort of majority opinion everywhere. And I would say maybe, but I would say what I've been saying, it's pretty close to the opinions of the majority, pretty much overwhelming majority in Russia, including the Russian government. On this point, I in complete agreement with Mr. Putin. And well, the basic assumption is that North Korea believes that nuclear weapons are vital for their security. You can say national security, you can say regime security. It depends on your individual political taste. But the assumption is that it's vital, and so it will not commit suicide. The North Korean elite will not commit a collective suicide by surrendering nuclear weapons. Nobody can blackmail North Korea in denuclearization. Nobody can bribe North Korea in denuclearization. So denuclearization is part of the Russian agenda, but everybody understands it's a distant dream which probably will never become part of life, at least, well, in the next few decades. So in practical life, three policies. It sounds remarkably like goals of China. So there is little surprise that to a very large extent, Russian policy towards North Korea is influenced by the Chinese policy. And it's logical. While Russia is not necessarily happy about increase of the Chinese influence in the region, Russia is not happy about it. However, basically on this line, Russia and China have similar interests: stability, division, denuclearization in such order. But there is one difference. Russian stakes are much, much lower. Because Russia, from the Russian point of view, North Korea is a distant country far away. It's not widely understood. I always see that it's not widely appreciated because in current American political discussion, Russian significance is completely inflated out of all proportion. When you read American media, you see that Russia is basically maybe the third largest country in the world. And Koreans, they cannot really accept that some countries don't see Korean issue as the most pressing issue of the world politics. But it's a sad truth. For Russia, North Korea and Korea is a distant country, far away, and it's really the case. Because yes, Russia and North Korea share a border which is roughly 12 or 14 kilometers long, border with China is about, North Korea's border with China is 1,000 kilometers. And on top of that, on the Russian side of the border, you have sparsely populated, seriously underdeveloped, I wouldn't say even agricultural area, it's largely forests. Basically tigers, bears, a lot of tigers, they say there, a lot of tigers, but not many people. And so it's really a distant place. So goals are similar with the goals of China, but stakes are much lower. And from here we go to another way, how much Russian government is going to pay for achieving the goals. We see that currently China is supporting North Korea on a relatively large scale. Judging by the dynamics of the market retail prices in Korea, we can be absolutely certain that North Koreans are getting significant Chinese aid, both as fuel and as food. What about Russia? Is Russia going to provide some help to North Korea, some assistance? Yes. Is it going to be large scale? Definitely not. Because when we look at the scale of trade, well, before the 2017, when the UN Security Council resolutions and a bit later COVID-19 pandemics created a total mess with everything, the trade between China and North Korea was roughly $6 billion a year, trade volume. Trade volume with Russia was roughly 100 million. People in the know will tell you that there is that Russian officially reported 100 million is not true. I know it. It's not true. Because a great deal of trade is done through China. Not so much because of political reasons. It's now increasingly politics, but used to be just logistics. And so some part of trade, some part of Russian goods go to China, and then from China they go to North Korea. They are reported in the customs statistics as trade with China. There is also a small, not quite negligible, but small illegal trade. So real figure is probably used to be 3, 4, maybe 500 million. Still 10 times smaller than trade with China. Personally, I'm inclined to say it's probably 20 or 30 times less. And once again, when we're listening about this kind of trade via China, which is true, you have to keep in mind other part of this story. That is, China also does a great deal of, always done. Chinese companies, Chinese individuals have always done a great deal of illegal smuggling to and from North Korea, which is also not a part of the Chinese statistics. So Chinese statistics also underreport the scale of trade. So Russia is not 100 billion, maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4. I'm talking about period before the sanctions, 2016. But China is also not 6 billion. It's probably 10 billion. So the gap is really, really large. We are talking about 10, 20, 30, maybe 40 times difference in the volume of trade, and it reflects pretty well the level of interest and level of stakes Russia has in North Korean issue in relation to China. So basically, I would say that unlike China, Russia is not going to provide North Korea with systematic, meaningful amount of aid. Some aid will be delivered, like China is doing it, both legally, so to say, and in defiance of the UN Security Council resolutions. But the scale is not going to be large. It's not going to make much difference in the future of North Korea. And it's going to be welcomed. However, even if you look at how North Koreans behave, you see that basically summit between Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin happened only once. How many times did he meet Xi Jinping? I suddenly forgot, 4 times or 5 times? Yeah, so it's basically another reflection, the same level. Whenever you look scale of aid, scale of trade, number of high-level visits, you see the same, basically different, basically 5, 10, 15 times. sometimes 20 times. And it does reflect marginality of the North Korean issue. What's going to change it, if it's going to change? I would say the increasing confrontation, the increase in the level and volume of confrontation between the Russian Federation and United States of America. Or generally speaking, Western countries, basically EU will count as well. If it happens, maybe because of the principle, our enemy's enemy is our friend. Maybe because of some tactical considerations, I cannot completely rule out that the assistance for North Korea is going to be increased. But personally, I don't see it as a likely scenario. And we should keep in mind that many people who are influencing this Russian policy towards North Korea have good memory. They are old enough to remember the late Soviet era, and they remember how North Korea was consuming large amount of the Soviet aid, giving almost nothing in return. And even if people are young, they still have been told the stories many times, they know. And the general assumption is that even if you invest a lot in North Korea, benefits of such investment are highly dubious. Finally, I have about a few minutes, 5-6 minutes. I would like to also mention the economic prospects and the this frequently discussed railway and gas pipeline projects. But let's start from general kind of trade. One of the reasons why trade between Russia and North Korea is so small is basically the major reason. It's simple. Their economies are mutually incompatible. Russia has a lot to sell to North Korea, but it's willing to sell on the international prices, and North Korea is not capable of paying international market prices. Of course, they'd be happy to buy Russian jet fighters, and maybe, well, not now under sanctions, but a few years ago it would be possible. But they had no money to pay. And nobody was going to give it free of charge. On the other hand, of few items where North Korea has competitive advantages, only one is of marginal, well, not many marginal, some interest for the Russian economy. Well, frankly, marginal. What are the items North Koreans are good at selling? First of all, mineral resources. But they believe that Russia, with entire Siberia and its disposal, North Korean coal is of little use. Mineral resources, Russia has a lot. So at the end of the day, North Korea is probably a competitor in this area. Seafood. Well, Russians don't like fish. I don't like fish myself. I was buying some lunch today for me and my secretary. Of course, he took some fish. I took some meat. I was growing in the society. I'm from working class, Russian family, and I was growing with the assumption that fish is for those who have no money or whichever to get real stuff, which is meat, beef or pork. I still believe it. And if you look at the seafood consumption, I have not checked straight from my memory. It's something like 19 kilos per person and going down, which is very small. In Korea, in say Northern Europe, you have 50, 60 kilos. In Russia, it's 19. So Korean seafood, thank you very much. It's not the stuff we eat. There's few exceptions, of course. Basically, not much interest. And finally, we have textile, and well, Bangladesh will do, India will do, Vietnam will do. The only item where North Korea has competitive advantages is, of course, labor. Because North Korean workers have been in Russia since 1946. I repeat, 1946, not 1967, as you can find in most materials, God knows why, because they had been before 1967 for 20 years, and it was never a secret, never hidden. The only difference with those who came earlier, they could basically escape. Many of them took Russian citizenship, and they're happily living in the 90s. Maybe some of them, I have met some of them. And largely their children and grandchildren. Anyway, there is some demand for North Korean labor, especially in the Far Eastern area. But let's face it, it's not a major issue. Of course, when in 2017, 2019, North Korean workers had to leave, most of them had to leave Russia. I talked to some officials in the Far East. They were really, really mad. They said we suddenly lost about one third of our workforce in the construction industry. As usual, these Moscow people made decisions without consulting us, blah, blah, blah. It's usual type of talk you are going to hear in the Far East. But having said that, it's still not vital for the country at large, even though some construction projects in Vladivostok or Khabarovsk have been threatened. Finally, in the remaining 3 minutes, I will talk about something which is talked a lot, about the railway and gas pipeline. I'll probably concentrate on railway, but everything I'm going to say about railway is completely applicable to the pipeline as well. You know, I like to tell this story how in the late 1990s, I came across a South Korean family. They had a boy who was going to enter college, and they suggested that he should study Russian because railway link was going to be constructed very soon, and there will be a great deal of jobs, they said in 1998, 1999. I have lost connections with this family, but this boy, he is probably in his, well, I would say early 40s by now. And where is the railway link? And I can assure you it's not going to happen anytime soon. Why? Because the railway link, from the point of view of the Russian railways, it's a high-risk project. Once actual the estimated price, well, there are many estimates, but let's say personally we have no time and it's not really that necessary to go into details. Let's say we are talking about roughly 10 billion US dollars, maybe more a bit. And because you have to build everything from the scratch. The North Korean railway system is not really a railway network. It's a living museum of the railway history. It's a 1930s technology. End of story. When they occasionally let me in, I'm, well, a bit of railway history fun. I enjoy it. Having said that, so basically, if imagine they have beginning of the work, Russian railway companies began to build the new everything in new, and then something happens. North Korean government decided it's time to raise kind of tension, and they launch a missile. Conservatives take power in Seoul and stop all projects with North Korea. Hardliners take power in Washington and stop projects. China also can do something. As a result, once real construction begins, the Russian investors are going to become essentially prisoners, of the foreign politics, and they don't want to be it. They don't want to become such prisoners. They want the Russian railway company, if they invest, will just lose money, a lot of money, because of some political crisis they don't have control over. They don't want to be prisoners. They don't want to be hostages. And it's why there is an interest, but it can become reality only if either some outside forces, not Russian company, if somebody pays for the project, Russian railways will participate. Or alternatively, if we have, say, 10 or 15 years of stable relations and cooperation between two Korean states, but I believe it's complete fantasy, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, not least because a North Korean state, which is freely interacting with South Korean state, is not going to survive for more than 5 years. If you have free interaction with the South allowed in North Korea will go down in flames immediately. Very simple. So it means that all this project is probably just, it will happen eventually, but not anytime soon. Maybe it's a task for 2075. Well, it's probably all what I wanted to say, just summary in 30 seconds. Yes, there is interest. Major goal, stability, division, denuclearization. Nobody seriously believes in denuclearization. Massive influence of China, because China has same goals at much higher stakes. Stakes are low, economies are not compatible, trade volume is low and unlikely to increase. Long-term investment projects are possible in a very long run, but not in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Andrei. You really covered the waterfront despite your preference against consuming seafood. And it reminds me, of course, of my ill-fated efforts to maintain a vegetarian diet in Russia and Ukraine, when I will tell my friends and colleagues I'm not eating meat, and they say, well, sausage isn't meat, so have some sausage. Maybe that's the compromise between seafood and beef and pork. Just a reminder to those in the audience, if you have questions, please email kennan@wilsoncenter.org, tweet Kennan Institute, or post on our Facebook page. Before I take the audience questions, though, I want to go to Jean to offer kind of an initial comment and any questions that she might want to inject in the conversation. Jean, please.
Thank you. I have so many questions, but I will try to limit myself, being the journalist that I am. I think that what's so wonderful about having Dr. Lankov join this discussion is that he really illustrates how complicated the relationship between North Korea and Russia is. I think from Washington, we tend to, because we're so far, and perhaps, Matt, you probably have a much more sophisticated, nuanced understanding, but we tend sometimes to forget to look at the complicated nature of these relationships, both historically and today. But I think that you've really laid that out. It's so interesting to look back at history and consider the relationship in terms of North Korea's reliance on the Soviet Union in the early part of the making of modern North Korea, the establishment of North Korea. I mean, obviously, we have a divided peninsula partly because we had that division in 1945 and the Soviets coming down from the north and the Americans coming from the south, right, and dividing the peninsula at the 38th parallel. But then the devastation of the withdrawal of support from the Soviet Union following the collapse in the early 1990s. And of course, as we know, that was followed by a famine known as the Arduous March that killed perhaps up to 2 million North Koreans. And I think we've seen the shift in influence from Russia, away from Russia and the Soviet Union since that period, as North Korea has tried to figure out how to stand on its own, and perhaps a shift toward China. But I have to say, having spent so much time in North Korea, I recognized when I was there how weak my understanding was of the Soviet influence on the making of North Korea. Because when you go to Pyongyang, and I have to say that I did go to Russia on assignment as well as a journalist. And so having had that experience, maybe a year or two before going to North Korea, I was able to see the influence and the connections between Russia and Korea in their society, in their culture, in their economy. And I don't know that I would have had that understanding had I not spent some time in Russia. And for me, living in North Korea, all the champagne we bought was Russian. So there clearly was a strong presence, that little bit of trade. I don't know how much of that trade is still going on now. Now, I just wanted to draw on this. You did really illustrate the lack of trade, particularly in comparison to the potential trade with China. And I'm glad that you mentioned the laborers, because I was going to ask you about that. I'd made a note to ask you about that because you mentioned the impact from the Russian perspective on losing, I think you said it was 1/3 of its workforce in the region, in parts of Russia where North Korean construction workers have been active. But what about the perspective from the North Koreans? What are you hearing? And I know that you spend a lot of time talking to defectors. How important was it for them to be in Russia in these jobs? What did it mean for them? And then how many laborers do we think are still there? I remember seeing a report that from Russia saying that they had missed that December 2019 deadline to send workers back to North Korea. And then a couple of days later, so they made that announcement in January 2020, the Russians, and then we saw a couple of days later that North Korea closed the border. So does that mean there are significant numbers of North Koreans still working in Russia? So I'm curious for you to share with us the importance of that that labor force in Russia for the North Koreans. And I might just ask that question, Matt, if that's okay, and ask him to answer that, and perhaps we can go on from there.
Please, Andrei, you'll have to unmute.
Yes, I will try to be short. First of all, just to make certain, I have always been arguing against a decision, UNSC decision, about ban on the North Korean labor. I wish that the Russian government, probably driven by considerations I like or considerations I don't like, it's irrelevant, will find legal, semi-legal, or illegal ways to keep these people, period. It's my political statement. Why? Because what I can easily see, and which has been the case for 50 years, for 70 years. First, for the average North Korean now, going to work overseas, it basically means Middle East or Russia. China is possible, but far, far less profitable. Going work overseas is the only way to create enough money to start his own business. Most of these people go to Russia. They work in very bad conditions. Their chances of die as a result of incident, I suddenly forgot, about 2 times roughly, don't quote me. If you like, you can check my article. I published an article in English about it recently. About 2 times higher than the chances, or even more, maybe 3, than the general number of incidents in the industry. They work 12 or 14 hours, everything. They have to give most of their income to the state. It's a confiscationary stuff. It's true. At the same time, until again 2017, when everything became a mess, the average worker made between $1 and $2, well, not made, saved between $1 and $2,000 per year. It means you spent in Russia 3 years. You come back with $5,000. It's enough for your wife. It's always done by your wives. Your wife will open a small kiosk or shop somewhere in Pyongyang, or buy a trade, a kind of there, a kind of place on a market. And it means that you will become a solid middle-class family. And it's the only way for them to get it. And when people tell you they are slaves, I tell you that in the 17th century in Central Africa, nobody was going to bribe a village elder for the right to board a slave ship to the Caribbean Sea. And every single Korean who is in Russia has bribed officials and security officials and party supervisors. Price used to be, again, before 2016, $400, $500 per person. You pay this bribe for the right to go to Russia, to become a slave, quote unquote. And when you come back, you usually save some money to pay another round of bribe, to do another round of bribing and go again. Because once again is the only way to learn what's going on. The only way to make money. And there is another part of the story. It's the only way for them to learn what's going on in the outside world. Technically, they are banned to have smartphones. Everybody has smartphones. They are surfing the South Korean website like crazy. I can tell you a couple of stories, anecdotal evidence from my recent trip to Vladivostok. In one flat, they used to have a North Korean worker who was putting tile. Good work, well done. And first it was a small work team, then only one person. He made a agreement with a kind of employer, actually it was his flat, that he will have a long lunch break for about 2 hours. And he will be sitting, eating his lunch and watching South Korean TV through satellite dish. Other story, another one, he was a guy who was employing the North Koreans. And then again, there was one person working his dacha, his countryside house. And he basically visited this guy with a bottle of vodka. They got drunk. And this guy, he began to say very nasty stuff about Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un and everything. And began to basically praise Russia because it's a wonderful free country. You cannot understand how happy you are, how rich and free you are. These people who go there, they come back with ideas. Yes, they are not going to be noisy. They are smart enough to keep their mouths shut, but they have different ideas in their brain. They knew how the world operates, and when opportunity arises, if it arises, which is a big if again, they will be a major force to change the country. And on top of that, they all are bringing money, and this money are not are going basically to the small independent businesses. They are helping North Korean families to get out of poverty, out of destitution. It's why I'm completely supporting it. How many people are now? I know not. I think it's between, I would say, 7,000-8,000. Now, they are not going to go back anytime soon because borders are closed, and I'm happy about it. And I hope that the Russian government will find some ways to sneak these people back as much as possible. If I know the ways, I'm not going to share it, but I wish them success.
So Matt, I'm just going to clarify that for North Koreans, as many people may know, it's illegal for them to watch foreign content, well, I should say Western and South Korean content. So what Dr. Lankov describes is something we hear from North Koreans who do go overseas, that it provides them with this opportunity. They can buy a phone fairly cheaply and access the internet for the first time. That's not something that most North Koreans can do. And so you have, even though these difficult conditions, this opportunity to see what life is like outside. And we always consider it's an interesting risk that the regime is taking as well, right? In allowing, they want their workers to go out there and make money and send it back. But it's an interesting dilemma for us as well in how to look at this. Yes, it provides them with a chance to experience the outside world and take that experience and that insight back to North Korea, but they are also making money that could be funneled back to the North Korean regime, and who knows where that's going. So it's an interesting question. I think that Dr. Lankov, I'm not sure that their visas, I think, would have expired, so they would be working illegally in Russia if they're there now. I did have one follow-up question, Matt, before I turn back to you, but I wanted to ask Dr. Lankov so I am actually co-hosting a podcast about North Korea and cyber called The Lazarus Heist on the BBC World Service, and our episode launching this week and next week does focus on North Korea's workers overseas. We don't go into Russia so much in detail, but I'm curious, do you think that we've seen reports about both Russians and North Koreans suspected in cyber hacks recently, the uptick in cyber hacks, particularly on vaccine labs? Do you think there's any collaboration there? And now I'm just speculating, but I'm wondering if you've heard anything about that.
You mean, sorry, I probably misunderstood. You're asking about cyber attacks collaboration. Well, I'm not privy in what is happening deep in the intel services, and sometimes strange things happening. But having said that, personally, if you ask my probability, no, I don't think so. If you look at the reports, Kaspersky lab, which is a major Russian cybersecurity lab, which is often accused of cooperation with the government, excessively close, I would say. They basically put everybody on alert. I think it was about a year ago, a bit less, about North Korean efforts to hack into the Russian missile programs. And it was a big it was not really big because it goes against the main line of the Western media. It's difficult for Western reader to swallow such difficult contradictory ideas because one baddies are fighting other baddies. How can it be? Wow. Anyway, so personally, I don't see, giving that for North Korean cyber attacks, especially when it comes to intel gathering, Russia is a major target. I'm very skeptical about any kind of cooperation, at least approved by the government, because in such cooperation, both sides are learning way too much. And frankly, I don't see why, say, the Russian hackers, government-sponsored hackers, would care to cooperate with the North Koreans. So I'm highly skeptical, and I believe that no sane Russian government, democratic or otherwise, will be happy to provide North Koreans too much insights in the Russian security systems, exactly because when it comes to stealing vital technological data, their major goal is Russia. Because their entire technological culture, their entire weapons system is based on the Russian designs. So they are not particularly probably that interested in the American missile designs. They will be thankful to learn, but not much more, because it will be much more difficult for them to copy. And the Russian designs is their dream. As somebody who has basically email broken by the North Koreans few times a year, successfully or not, I know not, but I have to take some precautions. I can assure you these people are very active.
So Andrei and Jean, let me bring in a few questions here from our listeners. Peter Toft at EKF Denmark notes that the Soviet Union, Russia afterwards largely abandoned North Korea in the early 90s. How do you perceive this past relationship influencing trust and the relationship today? And if I can add to that, it's interesting, Andrei, in a way you're presenting today's Russia as a window to the outside world, presumably also a window to the West. But then you remarked on the kind of zero-sum nature of Russia's own conflict with the West, and of course the reality we see in Russia today of Western content being increasingly either blocked or somehow limited, treated as a foreign agent, et cetera. Okay, I see you shaking your head. So why don't you comment on that aspect of the sort of ups and downs in the history of the relationship there?
I see two parts. Talking about Russia, yes, the government uses a Western agent description, which basically creates problem for, say, independent media when they try to find advertisement. It's true. And there are many things. But Russia is not China. I'm repeating it. Russia is not China. There is essentially no noticeable internet censorship. More internet censorship in the Republic of Korea than in the Russian Federation. As a person who lives sufficiently frequently, visits both countries, I can assure you. So if you, yes, I'm not saying that Russia is a democracy, God forbid, but it has a great deal of bloggers who write nasty stuff about the government and nobody is blocking them. You can just check some blogs and you see, wow, and nothing happens to it. Finally, I'm not aware about any attempts to block any significant Western, and especially South Korean website. And basically, I can assure you that North Korean workers are not reading stuff about Russian pro-democracy movement. They prefer to read South Korean media, which is freely accessible. By the way, most of the stuff about Russian pro-democracy movement is also freely accessible. Government tries to suppress them, but they are doing it in different ways, not Chinese ways. And unfortunately, increasing the smell of China, but it's small smell so far, light smell. I don't like it, but it's anyway. Having said that, so the first question is about feeling of abandon. I believe it's a completely wrong description. Because people, somebody who has written a couple of books and now thinking about another big book about the history which partially deals with relation between North Korea and Soviet Union. Well, I'm sure that person who asked this question is not perfectly aware that in the early 1960s, all officials who were seen as sympathetic to the Soviet Union lost their jobs. Everybody who before 1945, with very few exceptions, who worked in the Soviet Union and then moved to Korea, they all were ethnic Koreans, of course, they were basically lost their jobs and best were sent to prison or executed at worst. All North Koreans who married Russian women, it was nearly always North Korean males, Russian females, were ordered to divorce their wives, and wives were deported from North Korea in the 1960s. It was all Soviet publications in North Korea in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and so on were off limits. You needed security clearance in North Korea to read Pravda or Izvestia. You needed security clearance. So relations were very, very bad. And in the internal propaganda, most of the time, North Koreans, yeah, they used to say nice stuff about earlier periods of the Soviet of the Soviet history of the Soviet Union under Stalin, but even then they were playing down the real significance of the Soviet connection systematically up to comical way. Like if you read North Korean books, you will discover that North Korean books insist that liberation of North Korea from the Japanese was achieved by the North Korean fighting forces, which actually did not exist. Not a single Korean was fighting in Korea. According to the North Korean story, North Korea was liberated by the mighty army commanded by Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was a junior officer in the Soviet army. He had about 100 soldiers under his command, none of whom took any part in the war. And the Soviet military is mentioned as a kind of auxiliary force following the orders from Kim Il-sung. It's a bit like, I don't know even to compare, no good comparison comes from European history to my mind. Yeah, so relations have always been very, very tense. It was not a kind of brotherhood and alliance. In the internal propaganda, North Koreans have always described Soviet Union as a revisionist power which have betrayed socialism. In the 60s, in the 70s, and the 80s, they said, we have right socialism. Chinese are bad, Russians are even worse. Don't trust Soviet Union, they are enemies. If you are cozy to the Russians, you will be investigated. It was a normal situation. So yes, there was a great deal of support, but support was driven by geopolitical considerations because North Korea was equally decisively unpopular in the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So it was not a kind of friendship, it was a marriage of convenience. Because of geopolitical reasons, the sides needed one another. Yep.
So Matt, I was just going to jump in to make one comment, which is that I was just looking through some of my photos from Pyongyang in 2010, and I have a picture of a portrait of Lenin, that massive portrait that used to hang at Kim Il-sung Square in Pyongyang, which is their main plaza. And of course, and then I remember going to the plaza I think it was in 2012, and it was down. So from one day it was up, next day it was down.
April 2012.
Exactly. April 2012. That was when Kim Jong-un made his first speech, if you recall. And then we saw the slogan Marxism-Leninism replaced by Kim Il-sungism, Kim Jong-ilism. So it's very interesting to note those things. You know, I was just going to say that I do think that North Korea and Russia are very pragmatic about their relationship, and that President Putin does jump in when he sees the opportunity, especially if it is an opportunity to show some leadership in the region. North Korea is very smart about turning to Russia when it has a chance to play the game of divide and conquer with the countries that it's dealing with. And so that is something that I see them doing very strategically. There is a traditional relationship. And so that trip that Kim Jong-un made by train to Vladivostok, it was almost a complete replica of a trip that his father made to the region. So the propaganda was there to show, you know, Kim Jong-un uses it very strategically for his propaganda show, to show that he's following in the footsteps to a certain degree and that they have this shared heritage. But I think what will be interesting is to see if something comes out of these talks in Iceland, comes out of the discussion about a more multilateral engagement with North Korea, and whether they're able to change the dynamic of having this Russian-North Korean relationship that is there to step in when it's convenient, or if they're able to bring that relationship into the core discussion when it comes to denuclearization.
You know, Jean, you remind me with the reference to the special train trip 20 years ago. I think it was exactly 20 years ago this summer, if I'm not mistaken, because I was a student and I was in Russia when it happened. And I actually rode, if I'm not mistaken, my recollection is that Kim Jong-il actually went up to St. Petersburg, and his train could only accommodate a certain number of his retinue. And so I rode the normal Russian train, which was packed with North Korean diplomats, many of whom actually didn't speak a word of Russian or of English, but really enjoyed drinking and playing cards overnight, which is what you do on that train. And then I did get to see Kim Jong-il's limousine on the street in St. Petersburg the next day. So I have my personal brush with North Korean stardom. Just a final question. We have barely 5 minutes remaining. You guys have raised the issue of diplomacy, the potential of multilateral diplomacy, the influence that Russia may have in that picture. What would be your forecast for the resumption of something like a six-party approach to the North Korean issue? And do you think that Russia at this point, with all of its various interests at stake, including the conflict with the United States, do you think Russia will be poised to be, say, helpful in that equation?
Helpful to whom and in which degree? Big question. I think Russia wants status quo and again would like to keep North Korean nuclear program under control. As I have said, no sane Russian analyst believes that denuclearization is possible, irrespective of their attitude to the current government and its general policy at large. But Russia can play a role in the six-party talk because it's seen by North Korea as the least unreliable partner. North Koreans don't trust Russians. They dislike Russians, but they dislike it less. They mistrust them less than all other major players. So it's the least of all evil forces from their point of view. And it gives some advantages. However, now when we have the current level of confrontation between China, Russia, United States, I cannot see multi-party diplomacy coming back right now. Because with the current level of friction, it's difficult to cooperate. It was not easy when relations were so much better. So in the long run, yes, it's possible and even likely. Yes, Russia will have a role exactly because it has so little interest. It's not perceived by North Korea as a threat, relatively. It's not trusted, but it's, well, they are much more afraid of South Korea or China, by the way, China. Even though it looks like they are cozy to China now, but don't take it too seriously. So yeah, in the long run, yes, but not now.
Thank you, Andrei. Jean, let me give you the final thought and we'll close.
I will just note that we haven't seen the complete details from the Biden administration's North Korea policy review. And I think that we'll perhaps learn a bit more about it this week. And so I think that's why this conversation is so interesting to come at this time. I think that these are all really interesting ideas, whether or not Russia can be brought into that multilateral diplomacy, whether they will step forward and take a role, whether they are able to bring North Korea out of its isolation, how much they will be providing in terms of aid. They have provided food aid over the past year, perhaps on vaccines. I think all of this is in flux right now, but it's important to consider. And I think that Russia has been a quiet player, but it's important to look and see where the opportunity lies for North Korea to play a constructive role, as well as where they might play a disruptive role. But thank you so much, Matt, and to Dr. Lankov.
Yeah, well, let me echo that. Thanks, Jean, and simply say the whole point of this Global Perspectives series is to do exactly what we've done today, which is to bring you a Russian expert working in South Korea, talking about North Korea, to an American and European and broader audience. I'm so grateful for that opportunity. We touched just barely on a number of issues, including the pandemic. There's a lot more to unpack there. Obviously a lot of deeply baked in perspectives. Andrei, I appreciated the way that you challenged a number of the assertions that my questions implied and that audience questions implied. So we'll continue to do this again, and we'll certainly come back to the topic of Russia and the Korean Peninsula. Thank you all so much, and everybody have a great day.